Let's talk a little bit about principles of membrane transport and how substances move in and out of the cell, or how these molecules cross the cell membrane, and what are the key players that help the molecules do so. Well, cell membrane, first of all, is a selectively permeable membrane or a semi-permeable membrane. So the first point would be it is semi-permeable. Semi-permeable. This means that the cell membrane allows selective materials to move in and out of the cell. And the most easiest method to move things in and out is by diffusion. Well, diffusion is the movement of molecules across the membrane from higher concentration to a lower concentration. Higher concentration to a lower concentration. Now, this is the easiest way of moving in and out molecules. And this movement, it is governed by two factors. Number one is size of the molecule, and number two is hydrophobicity. Now, if the molecule is very small, or if the molecule is more hydrophobic, then the molecule can move through the plasma membrane very easily, because smaller molecules can pass through the phospholipid layers very quickly. And since the phospholipid bilayer is composed of the hydrophobic tails, the molecules that moves through this layer needs to pass this hydrophobic tail layer, and hence if the molecules are more hydrophobic in nature, then they can quickly pass the membrane and with greater ease. So here is a diagram or a list of things that passes through the membrane, and the first, that is the most easiest path for this the most easiest path through the cell membrane, these molecules: oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, steroid, hormones, etc. So these molecules tend to move faster and easier through the membrane. After that, the second comes the small uncharged polar molecules like water, urea, glycerol, and ammonia. Then comes the large uncharged polar molecules, which is not that much permitted inside the cell, but they can be moved inside or outside the cell through certain proteins that are involved, which we are going to talk about in a moment now. And lastly, the ions. Since these ions are charged, and that is, they contain a net charge on the molecule, and the degree of hydration, their degree of hydration is more, the ions are not allowed through the membrane at all, unless they are facilitated by some proteins that helps them move out. But for these large uncharged polar molecules and ions, they sometimes can move in passively through the membrane, but most of the times they are repelled by the membrane. The membrane do not allow these to move inside unless they're facilitated by some proteins. And for the ions, there is no question of these ions moving inside the cell or crossing the cell membrane on their own. They have to be facilitated by some proteins. Now, molecules can also be transported by membrane proteins, like I said. The diffusion was the most easiest one, and diffusion does not require any proteins to carry the molecules across the cell membrane. But some proteins that are present on the cell membrane, they can facilitate the movement of the molecules across the cell membrane. Like I said, for the large uncharged polar molecules like glucose or sucrose, and for the ions, which cannot move it all on their own through the membrane. So the first type of protein that help molecules to move across the cell membrane are called channel proteins. So channel proteins, and they look something like this green one. So these are called channel proteins. Channel proteins are nothing but hollow cylinders through which molecules can move through the cell membrane, and they interact very weakly with the solute to be transferred. So these channel proteins are like hollow cylinders, and they interact very weakly with the molecules to be transferred. And a classic example of a channel protein are the aquaporins. Aquaporins. Well, by aquaporins, you can guess it, because aqua means water, and porins come from the word pores. So some channel proteins that allows water to move in and out, which are called aquaporins. Although from this diagram over here, this chart, water can move through the membrane, on its own a little bit, but the membrane also has some specific proteins, some specific channel proteins that help move water in and out of the cell membrane. So these were channel proteins. And the second one, if we talk about the second one, are called carriers or transporters. So these are transporters. Transporters actually work a little bit different from that of channel proteins. Transporters bind to the specific molecules and undergo a conformational change, which eventually delivers the molecule across the cell membrane. So the transporters, or the carriers, they would first bind to a molecule that it needs to be. Let's say the molecule is here first. It binds to the molecule in an inward conformation, which binds the molecule of interest. Then what it does, it changes its conformation to a different one which faces the outside. And once this conformation is changed and it is facing the outside, this molecule can be released from the carrier or the transporter. So this is the basic mechanism of how a carrier works, and there are different kinds of carriers. There are glucose carriers, there are sucrose carriers, there are ion carriers, and and ions can also be transferred through channels. So these carriers and channels are the basic two types of proteins, membrane proteins, that help molecules to move in and out of the cell. And that's the basic principle of membrane transport.